Aaron here. Figuring out how to manage a requirement specification in Jira is one of the trickier and more frustrating things to figure out. So in this video, I want to share a simple but effective system for setting up your requirement specification using Jira Cloud and Confluence Cloud. Let's start with an example. Here I have an approved user requirement, and we can see this is just a regular native Jira issue, and this requirement is traced to other requirements that are downstream from it. So this is a user requirement and it traces to my function requirements that are downstream. It can also link to other user requirements that are related to it, and it can link to risk hazards, tests, anything else, any other data that I might manage inside Jira. Scrolling down, we can see this user requirement also has test coverage. This test coverage is established through the X-Ray app. One thing that's kind of cool here is that this test coverage is not established directly to this user requirement. You can see there's no direct link to the test case itself, but rather the coverage is established through the downstream functional requirements. So I have one test that tests my downstream functional requirements directly, and so we can monitor the test coverage at this higher level. And we can also see that this requirement has signatures by integrating with a third-party signature app, in this case eSign for Jira. So that was a quick preview of the setup on the Jira side. And if we switch over to Confluence, we can see how this manifests on the Confluence side. So here's an example of creating a functional requirement specification in Confluence. It's a single page. And scrolling down, we can list all of our function requirements dynamically from Jira right here in Confluence. So this creates a functional spec. And a little bit later in the video, I'll show how we can export this for approval or even snapshot this directly in Confluence. Now that we've seen a quick preview of the setup, let's take a look at how it's configured. So we're going to go to Settings and Issues. And the first thing we want to do is configure an issue type for requirements. In this setup, I'm using a single issue type that represents all requirements. Another option is to create separate issue types for every type of requirement you might have: product requirement, function requirement, etc. But I like to keep things a little bit more simple and use a single issue type for all requirements. Once you have your issue type configured, if you're using a single issue type like I did, you can then create a dedicated field for the requirement type. This would be a single select list, and inside this list is where you can add the different types of requirements that you might maintain. So for a simple demo, I have business, user, functional. You could add product, security, configuration, performance, whatever requirement types you maintain for your application. The next item for configuration is the issue linking. And we already saw that I was able to trace my requirements upstream and downstream from each other. And I did that through a custom trace link called trace requirements, with the descriptions of is downstream from, is upstream from. You could also use trace to, trace from, or whatever language your company is used to using. Okay, so we just configured our custom issue type, our custom field for requirement type, and the custom linkage for upstream and downstream traceability. The next thing to configure is our test coverage. And I like to use an app called X-Ray for Jira. And so to configure X-Ray, I can simply specify that requirement and any other issue types I want are eligible for test coverage. And I can also use my special issue linkage category, the trace requirements link, to show X-Ray how requirements are linked together so that X-Ray can provide that roll-up style test coverage that we saw a minute ago. Okay, so taking a second look at that requirement that we saw previously, we now know that this requirement is using a custom issue type called requirement. It has a custom field where I'm able to track that this is a user requirement, and I'm able to use my custom linkage to create the upstream and downstream traceability. In this case, my user requirement is upstream from my functional requirements. And if I drill into a functional requirement, we can see that this has a requirement type of functional. It is the same issue type of requirement, and it is downstream from my user requirement, and it has some direct test coverage. And this test coverage is what we saw rolled up into the user requirement on the previous screen. So in this way, using a custom issue type or multiple custom issue types and using Jira's native linking feature, you can create a requirement structure inside Jira. But here in Jira, this requirement structure is not very reportable, which is where our requirement spec in Confluence comes in. So switching over to Confluence, let's look how this page is configured. I'm going to edit this page. We can see that we're able to add whatever boilerplate we want to for our requirement document, and then we're able to use Jira macros directly inside this document to list out the requirements in an organized way here in Confluence. And this data, though, is reported in real time. So as an example, I have a header for my download calibration data feature, and if I look at this macro, I'm able to filter on all of the requirements where that single user requirement was upstream. So this is a dynamic generation of downstream user requirements for this feature, and you can list these out in any way that you want. You can leverage the components field, you can leverage versions, whatever JQuil you need to write to organize your requirements here in Confluence, you can do it through these Jira macros. Okay, so now we have our requirement spec here in Confluence. We're able to embed and report real-time the requirement data directly out of Jira. But the next thing we need to do for audit readiness is lock this page. And there's a couple of ways to do this. One easy way is to just simply export this page as a PDF and send this over to your document management system. But an even slicker way is to use an app called Static Snapshots for Confluence. And we can create a static snapshot of our dynamic data. So I can take a snapshot of the current page, snapshotting the dynamic data from Jira, and I can now either lock this page against that static snapshot, or I can just create a list of static snapshots for audit readiness, one for each release version, and leave this page as a living requirements document, which is my preferred strategy. And we can see if I jump over to the Static Snapshots app, it does provide me a list of all the snapshots for my requirement specification. I can associate version numbers if I want to, and very conveniently, I can even compare snapshots if you want to see how your specification has changed over time. So here's a static snapshot comparison with red lines and green lines of what was added and removed in our specification. And so that's a very simple, easy to set up system for managing your requirements in Jira and Confluence. Create a custom issue type or multiple custom issue types for your requirements. Add any custom fields that you need. Add linkage for traceability upstream and downstream. Set up your test coverage and build out your actual requirement spec over in Confluence using the Jira macros. Hope you found this video useful. If you want to see more, go to www.agile-innovations.tech. Thanks for watching.